500 years at a time. And we're up to the year 1000, and so we've covered already the period of the early church, and we talked a little bit about how the empire supports and also persecutes the church. Because the empire is there, the church grows. And once the empire kind of diminishes, the church begins to sort of take on the old structures of the empire. And then we went to the second 500 years, and that again was we're into sort of what we can call kind of a dark age when things became, we had a lot of barbarian invasions and a lot of heresies, and now we're up to the year 1000. And again, I have this map up on the wall here because it sort of shows a little bit about, because this is when there's going to be a hard division between East and West. That begins in this period of church history. Up until now, the church had a strong sense of unity. The Christians in the West would have prayed for the emperor in the East, and the Christians in the East would have prayed for the Pope in the West. But that's going to all change in the year, around the year, a little bit after the year 1000. And we are still in a period of time where we're separated from the Eastern Rite churches. Not all, but many. And that happens in part because of Islam, because Islam takes over the old ancient Christian lands of North Africa and of the Levant and of Greece. Right, that what we call Asia Minor, what is known today Turkey. All of that becomes sort of more and more Muslim and less Christian. And so that, when we had talked about in the West, there was a kind of scrappy quality to the West. They were sort of hunkered down and existing despite all of the rough and tumble. In the East, there was more structure, and there was more order, and there was more peace. Well, all of that is by increments being taken away. So we come to a period of time where we're sort of at a crossroads, as it were. Again, the Christian empire is Christian at this time still. And the ideal of the empire remains in the consciousness of Christians, I think even today, but certainly then, right? The idea of Christendom, that is an ideal that remains, even if it's a memory, even if it's a vague memory, even if it's a cultural vague memory, is something, where you see initially the empire as a sort of not very supportive of the church, but then it became very much supportive of the church. And then you begin to see Christianity, Western Christianity, Western civilization and Christianity in tandem. And this is going to be really where we come to the rise of the High Middle Ages. And we do this through what's called the Holy Roman Empire. And, we had Charlemagne in the past, and he sort of started the Holy Roman Empire, but it kind of falls apart because he divides it amongst his sons, and then they argue. And so there's a constant sort of struggle to sort of keep that reality together. But with Otto the Great, the Holy Roman Empire sort of comes really into a maturation. And again, I can't stress enough that this is not the Empire Strikes Back empire, right? This is not an evil empire where a dictator tells everybody what to do, and everybody has to walk marching goose step. That's just not what it is. It's very often the Holy Roman emperor has to personally know like 8 to 10 languages. So he's kind of an overlord, almost a spiritual overlord in some ways. And he's trying to keep together these various emerging nations, we'll call them duchies or kingdoms, if you will, and they might have their own systems of government, their own languages, their own traditions. And so the Holy Roman Empire is not, one size fits all, everybody's on a standard of everything. It's a much more loose confederation of things. But it's advantageous. And it's basically something that brings Christians together in a common sort of thread. And it helps, there is a kind of peace that evolves. And one of the things that, I was in Rome in the year 1999, and I was watching the news back in the States, and it was hilarious how, these talking heads on television, these anchormen, and they were talking about the Y2K. Y'all remember Y2K?
Yeah.
How, like, in the year 2000, all the computers were going to stop, and the planes were going to fall from the sky, and, there would be no more power. I have a family member who lives in New Jersey, and she told me that they just ran out of their Y2K stash of rice, about 5 years ago. So, people were just kind of going crazy, thinking that the world was going to come to an end, or there was going to be some kind of crisis. And you saw a lot of movies at this time that were about the apocalypse or about Armageddon. And there was a similar kind of reality up to the year 1000. And up to the year 1000, Christians were like, I think the Lord's coming back. So there was a kind of, survival mode, in this last generations up to the year 1000. But then the year 1000 happened, and Jesus did not come back. And so they went, okay, so we've got work to do. And so you begin to see a kind of renewal of Catholic culture at that time. So, you can look at churches that were built in the year 900, and they're just very sort of primitive. But then, look at the churches they were building in the year 1000 or, 1500, and they were just splendid. And so there's a kind of renewal of hope, right? A renewal of hope that's happening at this time. Now, but meanwhile, Islam is still an aggressor. And so back in Jerusalem, for example, Muslims have just destroyed the Holy Sepulchre. And that's the year 109. That's the grave where Jesus rose from the dead. And so that place that had been venerated for 1,000 years is so holy, just disappeared. And today you go to Jerusalem and you see this little edicula, this little temple that's built over it. And that's supposed to be where that cave used to be. But the cave itself is gone. And so that brings about a kind of frustration. As I've said before, like the West was constantly under attack, but it had remained Christian. And it was under a kind of, it had played defense for a very long time, and will continue to do so. But it's about to start an offensive campaign in what we call the Crusades. We need an entire class on the Crusades, but let me just say that do not believe everything Monty Python tells you, right? I have to say that the Middle Ages, even today, by supposedly intelligent people who run governments, who teach at universities, the Middle Ages get slammed for being this dark, oppressive time. And it couldn't really be further than the truth. The Middle Ages were a time of great advancement in society, a great advancement in culture, great advancement. Universities were built in the Middle Ages. Clocks were invented. This was a time for architectural wonders. This was a time for theological advancements. So it was not at all, a time of sort of slavery was nowhere in Europe. This was a time of, a real progressive time in many, many ways. And slavery would come back, with the Renaissance. Slavery would come back with sort of rejecting Christian culture and going back to Greco-Roman culture. But we shouldn't be ashamed of the Middle Ages. In fact, we should be proud of the Middle Ages. Something that there's a lot to be said for the Middle Ages. Printing press, great movement. So, for 4 centuries, the Turks had come into, the Ottoman Turks had kind of come into Turkey, but Constantinople survived. So that great, vast, rich, organized Eastern Empire, was almost a memory. About the only thing that lasted or survived of it was Constantinople itself. It was still a place that, the Turks just could not take. But, again, all of that will change. And all of this time, there were orders that were being developed in the Crusades. And we get our word hospital, which means a place that we take sick people. That also comes from our word hospitality. And so, it's related to our word hospitality. It's an idea of when the pilgrim goes to Jerusalem, they need a hospice, a place to stay. They need, and sometimes they need taken care of because they're sick. Because sometimes the pilgrimage is very hard on them. Sometimes they start out sick. And so, but the hospitaliers are one of the orders that come together. There are a number of orders of knights who are like monks, who are living a celibate lifestyle, praying like monks, but they're there to accompany the Christian pilgrim into the Holy Land. And from all of that emerges what we call the Crusades. Crusades were actually pilgrimages from the beginning. Because we're all over the place, we have to look at also what's going on in Northern or Western Europe. And one of the things that's a big epic event is the Battle of Hastings, 1066. This is the bringing of the Normans to Britain. Normans are going to bring a lot of good things and a lot of bad things. And the Byrds were part of the Norman invasion. So, I say this as my own family. But they kind of came over and they basically wiped out the Anglo-Saxon sort of ruling class, and they usurped all of that. So it's not as if things are perfectly peaceful in Europe. They're not, right? But for the most part, what's going on is the Crusades. But you have also these remarkable saints that emerge in the Middle Ages, like St. Margaret of Scotland. England and France are sister countries in many ways. Because of the Norman invasion, there's a sort of French monarchy in what is England. We'll speak French for a while. The English language that we have inherited from our own parents is part English and part French. And it's funny, the words, the poor words are the English words, and the wealthy words are the French words, almost always. So when it's in the barnyard and you're raising it because you're an Anglo-Saxon serf, it's a pig. But when you put it on the table, it's pork. It becomes the French word, right? When it's running around in the forest and you're shooting it so that you can take it back to the master, it's deer. But when it gets on his plate, it's venison. So, we have these kind of interesting words that evolve in that whole period of time that talk about, sort of the change that's happening still. And you see, even today, there's a kind of an affinity between, and a rivalry between France and England. That's a problematic rivalry, which always is in the background of the stories of the Crusades too. It's like, how do you get these countries that are claiming, rights of one another to actually work together? There are 8 crusades. We're not going to talk about them all, various, but I'm just going to tell you that there are 8, and there's, most of them are a complete disaster. But again, they were not just trying to force Muslims to become Catholic. Right? They were really just trying to open up historic Christian lands, Christian pilgrims, and to make it possible for Christians to live in those lands. Going backwards. So here we see the universities are being founded at this period of time. So it's a high level of education that's happening, a lot of conversation about human rights, about international law, really fascinating things that are happening, most of which we are completely ignorant of because our universities are secular, and because we don't speak Latin, and because we're terrible medievalist. But there were a lot of just amazing things that were occurring at this time intellectually within our Western culture. So there's a vigor, if I said scrappy could define us in the past, there's a kind of vigor that happens with the High Middle Ages. And these crusades are going back and forth. Very often, it's not clear what we end up fighting for in the end, right? So, sometimes it's just, please allow us to pray in our churches, right? And that's not a very big victory, but that was sometimes the victory we got. In all of this, we have also some remarkable saints who evolved. And the Dominicans come together at this time. The Franciscans come together at this time. So the Benedictines have been the primary sort of monastic side of the church for centuries, generations. And they became very wealthy because they would basically, Benedictines would go to some swamp and be given some land, and they would stay there for 700 years. And they would slowly change the swamp into a farm, to a vast sort of grounds, and they would make money, and they brought a kind of stability to Europe, right? In fact, the cities were kind of not really important at this time. The countryside was more important. More people lived in the country because so much of it was agriculturally based. And so the monasteries and the abbots and the abbesses had a lot of control. The abbess might be like the local governor. She runs the abbey, she runs the men and the women's side of the abbey. She runs the abbey grounds, but she also is something like a lord over this whole area. And so, but in all of that, the Benedictines become so wealthy that there's a tendency towards a kind of, I don't want to say corruption, but we'll say corruption. And so there's a need for reform. And so what you have is you have the rise of these mendicant orders. The Dominicans and the Franciscans are mendicant. They're begging orders. So they claim themselves to be poor. And so they can begin to reform the church, and they do. The Dominicans are formed to help against heresies. They also are great university professors. The Franciscans are also university professors. They become more of a missionary order over time. And then you start to see the development of the great cathedrals like Chartres. So you've got kind of this vigor where Europeans are going and fighting for the church in other parts of the world, not necessarily in Italy and in France and in England, and then they're fighting in distant lands for Christians in distant lands. So the West is kind of moving beyond itself. What that little scrappy part that it survived is kind of moving out. Thomas Aquinas, the great genius of the church. But in all of this, there are also bad things. And one of the bad things is Rome is a cesspool. It is, you see pictures sometimes of Rome, and it looks like a bunch of goats running around with, only the tops of the columns showing, and everything's covered with dirt, and there's no buildings. That's what had happened over time to Rome. Rome was becoming less and less important as a city. And so the papacy, always had been, the bishop of Rome. But Rome was becoming less and less defendable, less and less organized. And so what happens is there is a move of the papacy to France. And this is initially probably a good idea, but ultimately ends up being a problematic idea. So the church moves to France because that's where the action is, that's where the society is well organized, things are going well. And that begins what is sometimes called the Babylonian captivity that France is really battling. But it's a time when the papacy chooses and elects itself to go to France, but then it has a real hard time getting back to Rome. And there are consequences. And there are saints at this time that are starting to see the problem, and the problem is when the papacy is in Avignon, the French king and the French aristocrats and the French cardinals have more control. And so it's becoming something of a Gallican church, a French church. We had talked about France being the oldest daughter of the church. France had been for so long so supportive of the papacy. And yet it became intertwined and interwoven with French politics to a bad degree. Not that it wasn't completely intertwined and interwoven with Italian politics before, but because the French were so powerful, it became a problem, frankly, that the papacy was there for so long. Now, this is a real interesting term. We've had the High Middle Ages, now we're at the Late Middle Ages. And one of the things that happens that starts to put a damper on all the fun is the Black Death. And the Black Death wipes out something like a third of Europeans. Okay? So I want you to try to imagine Atlanta, or Georgia, or Washington, D.C., or New York, and a third, or a quarter to a third of the people are dead. Right? People who own the banks are dead. People who owed the banks are dead. All the children of the man who died with his estate to give to them were dead. The whole towns were wiped out. And like, how do you carry on when the social order is under such great pressure, really? And this is a defining moment in Western European history because things simply can't go on the way they have been going on before, right? So, you can't have a highly stratified, a highly strategic sort of society, when all the lords are dead, right? And then everybody else has to sort of pick up. So you start to begin to see a kind of rise in middle classes, right? You begin to see that, because everybody used to be, these people used to be in charge and they're all dead, so we're going to have to redefine things. And that is a real problem, but it's also a kind of opportunity, and it's something that will change. But in the midst of all of that, we still have this kind of remarkable positive optimism. So Florence can be suffering from the Black Death, and meanwhile they're building the Duomo. And this begins the Renaissance. And the Renaissance is a tricky word, but basically the Renaissance begins in Italy, and it has a lot to do with the fact that the popes returned to Rome. And so when they were in France, everything was more Middle Ages. When they come back to Italy, they begin to dig out these ancient temples, and they become more attentive to older Western, even pre-Christian culture. And with that comes, again, good things and bad things, right? With that, they adopt certain things. Like, I would say women had more power in the Middle Ages than they would have in the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, right? Because in Christian culture, the queen or the abbess could be very, very powerful. But once they moved back towards a more pre-Christian or classical culture, women's power had diminished. And that's just one example. Also, the return of slavery. So, they began to read the philosophical works and more, and it changed Europe. In a sense, they were reborn, but in a sense, they had become something slightly different. But you don't want to say that it's all bad. Again, such amazing optimism. When they built the Duomo in Florence, they had no idea how to do it, but they knew they wanted it done. So they just built this rotunda, and then they stepped back and said, okay, let's figure it out. And an architect came forward and sort of figured out the building of the dome. And it was the first dome built probably in 1,000 years. And it was huge. And so it became like, a Renaissance. This is something the Romans of old did, and we're doing it again. So there was positive things. Positive art became less stylized, more realistic. Music became less chant and more, it begins to get more florid. But again, even in the Middle Ages, you had such advancements in music, right? People started writing down music. People were doing polyphony. And it's just only going to get better in the Renaissance. when the papacy returns to Rome, there's something called the Western Schism. In the Latin West, there were two, sometimes even three, people claiming to be Pope. The guy who went back to Rome claimed to be Pope. The guy who stayed in Avignon claimed to be Pope. Another guy claimed to be Pope. And it just, the secular society was growing, but it really was a problem for the structure of the church. Eventually, it was solved. Eventually, they said, all three of you guys have to resign, and we're going to pick another one. It was not easy to figure out who was the real Pope. I mean, we have saints who would support one or the other. But one of the things that does, friends, is it weakens the power of the papacy, right? So that in a few hundred years, we'll see the Protestant Reformation. So that division leads to another division that would be even more sort of severe. The Western Schism ends in 416. And then in 1453, Islam besieges Constantinople. So we've had a lifetime, 38 years, right? Short lifetime, but a lifetime of division, of schism. In 1453, Constantinople falls to Islam. And the great Christian city is Christian no more. And the empire in the East that had been a Christian empire becomes something called the Ottoman Empire. And the Caliphate Sultan is in Constantinople, as the emperor had been before that, the Christian emperor had been before that, and yet it's going to be a very, very aggressive society for many, many years. So in the West, you have a renewal of Western culture, you have Renaissance happening, you have people rediscovering the past and building new art and architecture and in the old schools, you have a kind of a revival of Western culture to some extent in the West. And it's very beautiful, it's very aesthetic. And in the East, you have what had been the great, amazing cathedral of Hagia Sophia is now a mosque. And one of the things that happens is the Eastern Emperor wants the help of the West. And so there's a council in Florence, and they try to bring unity, because they've been divided, right? They've been divided for 4.5 centuries. And on paper, they work out the unity. And so they go back to Constantinople and they say, here it is, we've solved this schism, and the West is going to come to our aid. And in the East, they reject it. So in the East, they basically say the West are not Orthodox, they're heretics. And so in a kind of prideful stance, they refuse basically the help of Western Europe. And that's sadly not only going to be one of the reasons Constantinople falls, but it's also going to be one of the reasons that Moscow takes up the mantle. Sometimes you hear Moscow called the Third Rome, by which they say Constantinople failed, and so Moscow has become the Third Rome. And so now in Moscow, you have bishops there, which is really a kind of young Christian capital. But they presume to speak for all of the Orthodox churches. And so, when you talk about East-West relationships between the Western Church, which is Roman Catholic or Latin, and then all of the different Eastern churches, one of the problems is there's no one person that speaks to them. And the bishop, Archbishop of Constantinople, used to be that one person. But when they rejected him, rejected that unity, and it moved to kind of unofficially to Moscow, that sort of sealed the fate of that whole region. We begin to see a little bit of an expansion. And again, Europeans, what I said before, like Western society starts out Asian, African, and European. And because of Islam, it becomes primarily European, but it's not. It doesn't belong to Europe, right? So much. I think it belongs to the Mediterranean. But because of Islam, it was pressing in. It sort of hung on and survived in many ways in what is Western Europe. But with this new vigor, there's a new expansion. And you're going to begin to see Western Europeans trying to find more land and trying to explore more and trying to move even around Islam, right? Islam is such an immovable force, but if you have a ship, you can go around it. And so you begin to see a kind of renewal there. Sorry, Peter.
Is this
Oh, well, it was my last slide anyway. I can follow. And this sets us up for the last 500 years. In the last 500 years, what I want you to imagine is a circle, and in the middle of the circle is the Mediterranean Sea and the Black Sea. And on the eastern side is a river. And this is called, well, it's known by different names, but we'll say it's the Phasis River, okay? It's basically the river that feeds into the Black Sea. And on the southern side is the Nile. And on the western side is the Mediterranean Sea, and it breaks into the Atlantic. And that's the Gibraltar, right? And so you've got these two sort of walls, these two mountains. The Atlas Mountains are in Africa. Atlas was an ancient king in Africa, Western Africa. He becomes known as a god in Western culture. But those pillars of Hercules in the Atlas Mountains, those two great cliffs that sort of separate the Mediterranean and open it up to the Atlantic. Beyond there be dragons, right? That was sort of a place where it was almost impossible to imagine something farther afield than that. And yet Europeans began to do that. And that's where we start to see the age of exploration. And it's going to bring about, again, one of the things that's happening in Spain. Spain is kind of, Spain is a little bit it disappears for a while in Western society because it becomes Muslim. But there's a Reconquista. And so you have King Pelayo and Pelagius, and there's the northern Spanish kingdoms, and they began to slowly push Islam out. And by the time they'd finally taken the Iberian Peninsula and the Muslims no longer have control there, that's when they sent Columbus in 1492 to sail the oceans blue, who bumps into some place that he thought was India, but in fact it was not. But it's a great story, a great adventure, and one that we will continue with next time. But one of the things that I'd like to point out too is the Siege of Vienna. There was a number of great battles, and one of these is the Siege of Vienna, and that was on September the 11th and the 12th. And that, was kind of the last hurrah of the Ottoman Empire. That is not to say that there weren't Muslim pirates in the ocean, even in the time of when America was first established as a country. One of our first naval conflicts was with the Barbary Coast and these Muslims who were taking Christian ships and making Christians into slaves. So that was going on. One of the reasons why Europe moves north, in part, is because Islam becomes a master of the Mediterranean Sea. And so they would go into coastal cities in Italy, and they would just take the whole town into slavery, right? So Europe kind of concentrates more in the north. And as the Ottomans begin to lose power, and as the Christians begin to sort of take more control of things, then the Mediterranean becomes more open, the seas become more open, and the Rome can move back down into that, and the Pope can move back down to Rome. So you begin to see Europe kind of returning, and as it were, a little bit more to its cradle, and Western culture returning a little bit more to its cradle. These are such complicated stories, and I'm painting with such broad strokes. And so you are right if you're critical, because I didn't say this or didn't say that, because there's so much I didn't say, and I can't do it. But I hope that these give you kind of a broad sense of what's happening, and how your family may be from another part of the world, another part of Europe, and so you may have, well, that's not what was happening in Ireland. It wasn't, but that was happening in general, right? Overall, there was this kind of movement towards a renaissance and restoration of Christian lands. It didn't always win. The Crusades, they didn't necessarily win. But they began to push back against Islam. There began to be more of a confidence, and that begins to set us up to the age of exploration. Just kind of really walk the world. So I want to leave you with a quote. This is from Henri de Lubac. He's the great 20th century French theologian, one of the finest ones of his era. And this is from his Paradoxes of Faith. And he says this: Christianity is not one of the great things of history. It is history, which is one of the great things of Christianity. Right? So, sometimes I think the secular society will say, well, that's not really what's happening, because they'll be looking at things from the perspective of, I don't know, communism and capitalism, or materialism, and really the story of history, much like it is in the Old Testament, is the story of the Bible. And so the Bible starts out in these little lands, and then they go a little farther, and they go a little farther. And in a similar way, Europe used to think of itself as this land around the Mediterranean Ocean. But Western culture is going to go everywhere. Western culture is going to be in the Far East. Western culture is going to be in sub-Saharan Africa. It's going to be in the Americas that nobody even knew where they were there. So Western culture is going to really stretch out and move. And again, sometimes it's Christian, sometimes it's not. Any questions? Thoughts? Yes, Thomas.
Father, you went through that period where the popes were not in Rome, and I think you had a picture of St. Catherine of Siena up there, and just a moment of her influence of this great doctor of the church.
St. Catherine of Siena, a doctor of the church, genius, great theologian, everybody should read her books. She was a woman of letters, and she was a very powerful person, well respected. Popes would write her and ask her thoughts, and she is the one who basically nagged the papacy back to Rome. You know, because she just kept telling the popes, y'all have got to get back to Rome. And she was right. And so St. Catherine of Siena is one of those great voices that sort of began the return of the papacy to Italy. Now, friends, I'm going to tell you, the Renaissance papacy could be so corrupt, right? And then it didn't, you know, just because they came back to Rome didn't mean they were all going to be holy. I would love to be able to tell you that, but I can't. But it was better for Europe, better for the world, and better for the church, for the Pope to be in Rome. And just as Constantinople had been a powerful capital, and Rome had been kind of a backwater, you know, and nevertheless, the Pope in Rome is the tyrant, culturally. And so that's that ecclesiological thing. It's not based on power, it's based on sort of the word of the Lord. You are Peter, you know, and on this rock I will build my church. And not even the devil will bring it down. So, anyway, Catherine of Siena is awesome. Helpful?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, see you next week. Thanks, everybody.